Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to AusBooks, where I'm talking about random Australian books I own, and we have an absolute favorite of mine, one of my favorite Australian authors, and that is the one and the only Charles White. And as visual prompts, I have his two-volume history of bushranging. Here it is. Oh my god, how am I going to hold this for you? Because I have a nice cover where you put them together and it shows a scene, and I've got like nice wraparounds and all that stuff. But who is Charles White? Well, he is arguably, I think, the greatest Australian historian of the 1800s. That's not a high bar to clear, to be honest, because it's not really that many, unless you go like first-hand accounts and all that stuff. But primarily historian, you can't go wrong with Charles White. So I'll tell you a bit about him before we get to his actual books. He was born in New South Wales in 1845, right? And we don't know much about his early life besides the fact he just, lived. But in 1858 is where his story really kicks in, because he brought the Bathurst Mining Journal, and he also worked as a policeman too. And he brought this on the cusp of the 1860s, right? And the 1860s were very a tumultuous time for Australia because of the insanely high crime rate that was going on. Again, this is Eureka Stockade level. When it came to, yes, other countries were still, sending all their criminals to Australia, but also there was the gold rush going on. So you had all these, people from all around the world coming here with, pretty much really no rules put in place, because no one had really thought that Australia was going to take off when it comes to population. So very much, let's just say if you came here to Australia with your young family and you lived on the goldfields, which would have been very poor, and you just worked, trying to make a living, and all that stuff. And it was really hard because there was no real guaranteed when it came to your savings and anything if you find gold. So let's say, again, you have that young family and you all go to sleep at night and you wake up and your stash of gold, where that you've been searching for months, maybe even years, is just gone. Someone's robbed you and you can't do a single thing about it. And that's just how it was. And all of them were bushrangers. No one liked them. No one. It was just a crazy, crazy time. Again, I've given you many, many books about Australia during this time. Go watch my other Ausbook videos, but also my Auslit video where I gave you some just general facts about this time to put this in context, to see what Charles was witnessing. And all of this he loved. He was very interested in this time. He developed a passion for documenting all these criminals, which would pay off later on. But he was soaking all of this in. He was, besides the fact he was a police officer on the scene, he was also a journalist, and he was documenting this, going to all the trials, like pretty much everything you can do. He also had a very big passion for early Australian history, and he done his best to document that. He'd done so much throughout his life. He wrote a lot about pre-Federation Australia, debates at the time whether Australia should be federalized, and just stuff like that. And it's really interesting. Eventually, he went on to publish a couple of books, which I'll get to soon. But yeah, he wrote a lot. Like, he lived quite a long life. He nearly lived till he was 80. But sadly, in 1911, he had a fire in his study room in his farmhouse, and he lost all of his records that he kept. He had interviews with bushrangers, with people who were there in certain events. Like, literally every primary source someone could collect about early Australian history, it was lost right there. But Charles would keep on writing until his death in 1922, I believe, or 23, no, 22. And he was very influential. As a historian, he primarily focuses on the main facts of everything that's going on. Again, main records, trial papers, like literally every primary source he took into account, because a lot of Australian history is more focused on the folklore and the mythology of certain people. And Charles White just completely grabbed it and chucked it out completely to focus on the actual truth. And as he says in the introduction to his first volume on Australian bushranging, is that there will never be a perfect early history of Australia because so much of it has been lost over time. And also, you got to realize the way Australia was first colonized. It wasn't the most, let's just say, literary place ever. But Charles White did write a lot of stuff, actually. He wrote an early history of Australia, which is in 2 volumes. I don't own them physically because I don't think they're in print anymore. These are all on Project Gutenberg too, so if these sound interesting, go check them out. Again, you'll really want to. I'll sell them to you, like literally. But yeah, he done a really, really great early history of Australia that you should check out. It's up there with Robert Hughes and a couple other ones, and they're escaping my mind right now. But I've talked about these books before. He also done one of the first history books of Aboriginal people, written by someone who wasn't one of them. It's called The Story of the Blacks. Again, there is some bit of talks about the Aboriginals in a way that is very dated, but considering he wrote this in like literally the 1910s, it's, I think, very interesting. And he keeps his biases very much to the side because he's here for the history. And I feel like compared to a lot of other, Europeans and British people writing about Native Australians, it's definitely not the worst. And I think it's, from that time period, one of the best because it's not that, hateful compared to some other people. And also it actually includes the way they integrated with the Europeans and all that, rather than just completely them chucking these people out to the side and in history books and all that. So if you want a period piece, that's really good too. But the main thing Charles White will be remembered for is his 2 epic volumes of Australian bushrangers here. What are bushrangers? Because I know some people don't know what those are. They're pretty much just criminals who ran into the bush and just committed crimes their whole life. Like that's literally it. It's like our version of Western outlaws, pretty much. It's different name for that. And Charles White documents all of them. He includes historical notes about all these famous people, sketches, death mask sketches, like literally everything. His introduction, he talks about how they started in Tasmania, because that was a way more violent place than Sydney ever was. And just it gives you a nice, perfect history of bushrangers, and also talks about just the main people, case studies. It's so readable and it's so fun. Once you get the taste for Charles White's writing, it's just so fun. And yes, he does in the second volume talk about Ned Kelly too. Especially, I think, this in the second volume, a quarter of that book is spent on the Kelly gang, which it kind of makes sense even back then when this was written. But there's just so many famous bushrangers here. He, talks about how he interviewed some of them because they came out to see him as he was writing these history books, and it's just perfect. It is an essential resource to have if you want to learn about Australian history. I wouldn't trust anyone if they don't have these books on their shelves, to be honest. But it's just such fun reading, to be honest. Again, go on Gutenberg. You will find this and his History of Australia there. And that's your AusBooks for today. But before, oh my god, I didn't even mention that his children, because Charles White's eldest daughter was Mary Gilmore. Look on that $10 note, and she's right there. She's one of Australia's most famous poets, even though she's not even in print anymore. And which kind of like upsets me in a way, because that means that my favorite Australian historian, probably outside of Manning Clark, is genealogically connected all the way down to Scott Morrison. And I don't want to think about that because it already hurts that Mary Gilmore's like connected to ScoMo, but to have Charles White too, it's a bit too much for me, and I tend not to think about that. But it's just a nice little bit of history. And yeah, that's your AusBooks for today. Charles White, the greatest Australian historian of the 1800s. What do you want me to say? go to Project Gutenberg and get everything they have of him and just read him because he's just so approachable and just so fun to read in a way that a lot of other Australian history books kind of aren't in a way, at least from this time period, but we'll talk about them maybe, I don't know. But yeah, Charles White, so go read him, let me know what you think about him, and yeah, so thank you so much for watching BookTube, and I will see you next time.